England's southern colonies in America were those of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Out of the 13 colonies, Virginia was the first to be established, and Georgia was the last. The southern colonies were quite different from England's other American colonies because their economic success depended almost completely on the use of large numbers of slaves. Although most of the people who founded the southern colonies had not been familiar with slavery back in England, in America, the use of slaves allowed many of them to grow rich. Like the colonists in England's other colonies, those that settled the South brought their language, customs, religions, and racial beliefs to America, and they adapted their old ways of doing things to make them work in a strange new land. Most changes were made in how they farmed and lived their daily lives, but others were in the laws they made and the ways they governed. Things like these blended together during the almost 200 years that England ruled in America and helped lay the foundation for the unique culture of the United States. The first English colony, Virginia, was founded in 1607 by members of the Virginia Company of London. Their story was in many ways typical of the early colonists, while in others it was not. The 104 men and boys who made the voyage to Virginia planned to search for gold and to try to find a new route to Asia. As the ships left England to cross the Atlantic, many of the passengers had worried about the long voyage that lay ahead of them. But by the spring, after 4.5 months at sea, they had safely reached the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. After exploring, they found an island in a large river that flows into the bay and decided to build their settlement on it. First, they had to cut down trees, clear the land, and make wooden beams from which to build houses. They filled the spaces between the beams with woven branches and mud, a building method called daub and wattle, and they made thatched roofs from reeds that grew in the nearby swamps. When they were done, the houses of the settlement they named Jamestown, after King James, looked a lot like those they had known in England, but most of them were quite small and had only one room. As time went by, the colonists also built barns where they could store supplies, and they built a new church where regulations required them to worship twice a day. They even sharpened logs to make a wall all the way around the first English town, or fort as they called it, for protection against both hostile tribes of American Indians and from the Spanish soldiers that lived to the south in Florida. Most of the work of building Jamestown was done by the poorer colonists. The other half of the colonists were wealthy members of England's upper class who, according to the old English ways of doing things, were not expected to work. This caused many bad feelings at the colony, but that was just one problem Jamestown faced. Another was that it was built on swampy land that was bad for farming. Most of the drinking water was no good. The swamps were filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, and because of these things, as well as starvation, around 440 out of 500 colonists had died by the spring of 1610. It is not surprising that Jamestown almost failed, not only because of illness and starvation, but because no gold had been discovered, and because the colonists hadn't found any good ways of making a living. But just when they were the most discouraged, new people came from England, and they settled on healthier lands where they could farm. The Jamestown colonists were led for many years by this man, Captain John Smith. He was an excellent governor, as well as an explorer and map-maker. Smith put the upper-class colonists to work. He kept everyone from starving by buying corn from the Native Americans, and also by learning how they hunted animals for food. One day, while John Smith was out exploring, he was captured and threatened with death by warriors from an unfriendly tribe, only to be saved by the chief's daughter, Pocahontas. Later, she married one of the colonists and began dressing like an Englishwoman. Her husband, a plantation owner named John Rolfe, had worked for years developing a mild, sweet kind of tobacco. The English settlers in Virginia started raising lots of tobacco plants, and they grew quite well. After the leaves were harvested and dried, the tobacco was shipped off to Europe, where the dangerous habit of smoking was just becoming popular. As the years passed, tobacco farming brought the colony great prosperity. In 1619, the people of Jamestown elected an assembly of men called the House of Burgesses to make laws for their growing colony. That turned out to be a very important year because it was the beginning of representative government in America. Unfortunately, 1619 was important for another reason as well. It was the year the first African slaves were sold to Virginia tobacco planters by a Dutch trader. After that, thousands of more slaves were put to work in the colony's plantations, and this allowed their owners to live in fantastic luxury. By the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, a powerful society of large plantation owners controlled the colonial legislature in Virginia. Two of the most famous of these Virginia gentlemen were George Washington, who maintained his beautiful plantation of Mount Vernon alongside the Potomac River, and Thomas Jefferson, whose grand plantation called Monticello stood far to the west in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Both plantations had hundreds of slaves. The second southern colony, Maryland, received a royal charter in 1632, 25 years after Virginia was founded. Maryland was the first of what were called the proprietary colonies. That is, colonies that were run by an owner or proprietor. The first proprietor of Maryland was a wealthy Catholic nobleman named Cecil Calvert, also known by his official title, Lord Baltimore. Proprietors such as Calvert were the men to whom kings granted colonial charters. Colonial charters normally required the proprietors to abide by basic English laws, but they were given the right to use the colony's land and to defend and administer the colony as they saw fit. Calvert wanted the colony of Maryland to be a place in which large estates would be owned by Catholic noblemen, who would then profitably rent out the land to others. St. Mary's City, the first capital of Maryland, was founded in 1634, when colonists sailing from England arrived on the shores of a beautiful inlet of the Chesapeake Bay, not far from the eastern boundary of Virginia. On board the ships were 2 Catholic priests and the families of 17 Catholic gentlemen. In addition, there were about 200 other people who were mostly members of the Church of England. In the beginning, some colonists moved into houses in which Native Americans had lived. They furnished them with their own belongings, but soon they constructed English-style houses and other buildings. Over the years, St. Mary's City turned into a busy little port town, serving the needs of a major tobacco exporting colony. As the headquarters for Maryland's colonial government, it was the only place for colonists to come if they had dealings with the court. And to accommodate such travelers, St. Mary's City had a well-equipped ordinary or public inn. The young women